9 coffins were prepared before the explosion, not after, before, loaded onto a lorry at Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee in the small hours of March 7, 1923, alongside 9 prisoners, a landmine, coils of rope, and a bottle of whiskey for the soldiers who would need their nerves steadied afterward. The coffins were not a contingency, they were part of the plan. And within the next 10 days, in 3 separate locations across County Kerry, 17 men would be tied to landmines and blown apart by the army of the state they had helped create. Not a single person would ever be charged. To understand how the Irish Free State came to murder its own prisoners with landmines, you have to understand Kerry in early 1923. The Irish Civil War had been raging since June 1922, when the provisional government shelled the 4 courts in Dublin to dislodge anti-treaty IRA forces who rejected the Anglo-Irish treaty signed with Britain. The treaty had given Ireland dominion status, not the full republic that many had fought for, and required an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. For those who accepted the treaty, it was a stepping stone. For those who rejected it, it was a betrayal of everything the War of Independence had been fought to achieve. And so men who had stood shoulder to shoulder against the British Empire were now killing each other. Kerry was the bloodiest battlefield of the entire conflict. The county was overwhelmingly anti-treaty, with 3 strong IRA brigades operating across its mountainous, difficult terrain. When Free State forces arrived by sea at Fennet in August 1922 and captured Tralee, the conventional phase of the war ended quickly, but the guerrilla war that followed was savage. By March 1923, 68 Free State soldiers had already been killed in Kerry and 157 wounded. The anti-treaty IRA ambushed patrols, mined roads, and attacked garrisons. The Free State responded with mass arrests, brutal interrogations, and, increasingly, extrajudicial killings. Between November 1922 and February 1923, the Free State government had formally executed 55 Republican prisoners across Ireland. 4 of those executions took place in Tralee. But formal execution, with its veneer of legal process, was only part of the story. In Kerry, captured Republicans were being shot in fields and on roadsides without any pretense of trial. The county was descending into something that looked less like a civil war and more like a campaign of terror. The man overseeing this campaign was Major General Paddy O'Daly, and his identity is central to understanding what happened at Ballyseedy. O'Daly was not an ordinary military officer. During the War of Independence, he had commanded the Squad, Michael Collins's hand-picked assassination unit, sometimes called the 12 Apostles. These were the men Collins had deployed to systematically kill British intelligence agents, Royal Irish Constabulary detectives, and informers. They operated in plain clothes on the streets of Dublin. They shot men at breakfast tables and on tram platforms. They were, by any measure, professional killers in the service of Irish freedom, and they were extraordinarily effective. O'Daly had personally led the ambush on the British Viceroy at Ashtown in December 1919. He had been at the burning of the Custom House. He had spent years in prison for the cause. When the treaty split the IRA, O'Daly and most of the Squad followed Collins into the Free State's National Army. The Squad was reconstituted as the Dublin Guard, a brigade-sized unit staffed largely by the same men who had carried out Collins's most ruthless operations during the independence struggle, and it was the Dublin Guard that was sent to Kerry to break the anti-treaty resistance. O'Daly brought with him David Nelligan, Collins's legendary spy inside Dublin Castle. These were men shaped by guerrilla warfare. Men who understood terror not as an aberration, but as a tool. O'Daly himself would later say of his time in Kerry, "Nobody asked me to bring kid gloves, so I did not bring any." The brutality in Kerry had been escalating for months before March 1923. Prisoners were beaten during interrogation. Some were tortured with hammers. Intelligence Officer Nelligan personally conducted interrogations that left prisoners with broken bones. But it was an event on the night of March 6 that would push everything past the point of no return. Near the village of Knocknagoshel in North Kerry, the local IRA had set a trap. They spread word through a known informant that an arms dump was hidden in a field at Baranarig Wood. It was a ruse. Beneath a pile of stones covering a fake dugout, the IRA had buried a powerful booby-trap mine. At roughly 2 in the morning on March 6th, a party of 8 Free State soldiers arrived to investigate. They were led by 3 Dublin Guard officers, Captain Michael Dunn, Captain Edward Stapleton, and Lieutenant Pat O'Connor. Dunn and Stapleton were not just any officers. They were veterans of Collins's squad, close personal friends of Paddy O'Daly, men with what O'Daly himself described in his report as brilliant pre-truce records. When the soldiers began moving the stones, the mine detonated. 5 men were killed instantly. Body parts were strewn in all directions. A 6th soldier survived, but lost both legs. The IRA members who had planted the mine were hiding in a dugout a mile away. Sources suggest they heard the explosion and went back to sleep. Knocknagoshel represented the single highest daily death toll for the Free State Army in Kerry. When the news reached Paddy O'Daly at his headquarters in Tralee, witnesses described him as going berserk. He had to be physically restrained. 2 of the dead, Dunn and Stapleton, had been with him since the squad days. They had fought the British together, killed for Collins together, built the Dublin Guard together. Now they were dead, blown to pieces by the men O'Daly considered traitors to the very cause all of them had once shared. What happened next was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was premeditated, organized, and systematic. O'Daly issued a formal memorandum stating that from now on, Republican prisoners would be used to clear mined roads. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. And within hours, the machinery of reprisal was already in motion. The prisoners selected for Ballyseedy had nothing to do with Knocknagoshel. They had been captured weeks earlier, most of them during February, and had been held in Ballymullen Barracks and the Tralee workhouse. Some had been so badly beaten during interrogation that they could barely stand. According to the account of historian Owen O'Shea, based on his research for the book No Middle Path, The Civil War in Kerry, the prisoners were deliberately selected from different units of the Kerry No. 1 Brigade. Not because they had any involvement in the Knocknagoshel ambush, but specifically because their deaths would serve as exemplary punishment, a message to every IRA unit in the county. The 9 men chosen were Patrick Buckley from Scartaglin, John Daly from Castle Island, who had spinal injuries so severe he could not walk, Patrick Hartnett from Listowel, Michael O'Connell, John O'Connor, George O'Shea from Kilflin, aged 26, a captain in the Kerry No. 1 Brigade who had fought in the War of Independence, Timothy Tuomi, also from Kilflin, James Walsh of Churchill, and Stephen Fuller from Fahavane near Kilflin. Some of these men had broken bones from their interrogations. John Daly's spine was so damaged that he had to be carried. Another had a broken arm, another a broken wrist. They were not combatants posing a threat. They were prisoners, injured, bound, and completely at the mercy of their captors. In the early hours of March 7, 1923, the 9 men were roused from their cells, placed in a room together, then marched onto a lorry. The atmosphere at the barracks was described as menacing. Historian Diarmaid Ferriter would later write that there was a lust for revenge among the Dublin Guard troops. The lorry drove roughly 2 miles from Tralee to Ballyseedy Cross, a remote stretch of road bordered by dense woodland. What happened there is known in extraordinary detail because one man survived to describe it. Stephen Fuller gave his testimony in fragments over the following decades. First in a brief statement released to the press shortly after his escape, and then, nearly 60 years later, in a filmed interview with historian Robert Key for the landmark television series Ireland, A Television History. Fuller's account is corroborated by the independent testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Niall C. Harrington, a National Army officer who provided his own account of the events. Confirmation from within the Free State's own military that what happened at Ballyseedy was a deliberate execution, not an accident. According to Fuller, the prisoners were taken down from the lorry at Ballyseedy Cross. Their hands were tied behind their backs. They were bound to one another, arms and legs, with roughly a foot of rope between each man. Then they were arranged in a circle facing outward, their backs to a log. Beside the log was a landmine. A rope was passed completely around the 9 men, binding them together. Their caps were removed, and then one of the soldiers told them they could be praying as long as they liked. Fuller later recounted the final moments with a specificity that is devastating in its quietness. The man next to him said his prayers. Fuller said his own. But even as he prayed, he kept his eyes open, watching the soldiers as they retreated to their positions. He would later say that this single act, keeping his eyes open, watching where the soldiers went, was what saved his life. Then his comrade said goodbye. Fuller said goodbye, and the word passed around the circle, "Goodbye, goodbye, lads." And then the mine was detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. The force tore the men apart. Body parts were flung across the road and into the trees. Flesh hung from branches. The scene was so destroyed that individual bodies could not be distinguished. Local woman Rita O'Donnell, who lived nearby, witnessed the explosions and gunfire and saw human remains scattered about the following morning. The soldiers, their nerves reportedly fortified with drink, shoveled what remained of the men into the 9 coffins that had been brought for exactly this purpose. Bill Bailey, a local man who had joined the Dublin Guard, later told the Republican writer Ernie O'Malley that the bodies were handed over in condemned coffins as a band played jolly music. But Stephen Fuller was not in those coffins. By some explosive freak, as one contemporary account phrased it, the detonation had thrown him clear of the blast, into a ditch at the edge of the road. He was severely burned. Stones and shrapnel were embedded under his skin, but he was alive, and the carnage was so complete, the dismemberment so total, that the soldiers could not account for individual bodies among the remains. They did not realize anyone had survived. Fuller crawled from the ditch, crossed the River Lee, and disappeared into Ballyseedy Wood. He made his way, burned and bleeding, to the house of Charlie Daly, where local families sheltered him and tended his injuries. He was moved from safe house to safe house for months. When his name appeared in newspaper reports listed among the dead, Paddy O'Daly sent a communication to General Headquarters claiming that Fuller had been reported as having become insane, an attempt to discredit him before his testimony could emerge. The Dublin Guard scoured the countryside searching for him. They never found him. The official Free State version of events, released through the Kerry Command, was that the prisoners had been killed accidentally while clearing a mined road, that the IRA had planted the mine and the prisoners had triggered it during forced labor. It was a lie, and it fell apart almost immediately. Because Ballyseedy was not the end. It was the beginning of a 10-day sequence that would prove, beyond any doubt, that what happened was policy, not accident. On the same day as Ballyseedy, March 7th, 5 prisoners from the Kerry No. 2 Brigade were taken to Countess Bridge, near Killarney. They were subjected to the exact same procedure, tied to a barricade. A mine placed among them. The mine was detonated. 4 men were killed. But once again, by an almost inconceivable repetition of the miraculous, 1 man survived. Tadg Coffey was not killed by the blast. According to a reference written by IRA officer J.J. Rice and preserved in the Military Service Pensions collection, Coffey was not stunned by the explosion. but got to his feet and ran about 200 yards along the open road under machine gun and rifle fire. He escaped. His testimony confirmed exactly what Fuller had described at Ballyseedy: prisoners tied to a mine, deliberate detonation, a cover story prepared in advance. If anyone in Dublin still believed that Ballyseedy and Countess Bridge had been accidents, two separate accidental mine detonations killing prisoners on the same night, they would have had to explain what happened 5 days later at Ballyseedy, near Cahersivan. On March 12th, 5 prisoners from the Kerry No. 3 Brigade were taken from the old workhouse in Cahersivan, which was being used as a temporary military barracks. They were taken at gunpoint by members of what was known as the Visiting Committee, a euphemism for the Dublin Guard officers who carried out extrajudicial killings. The local garrison protested. They were overruled. The prisoners were brought to a roadside barricade several miles from town, and this time the soldiers had learned from the survivals at Ballyseedy and Countess Bridge. Before placing the men around the mine, they shot them in the legs. Every prisoner was shot, specifically to prevent anyone from running if the blast did not kill them. Then the mine was detonated. All 5 men died. There were no survivors. The compensation claim filed by Maurice Reardon, father of one of the victims, is preserved in government files. He wrote that his son, William, was removed from the workhouse, and it is alleged was done to death by being dragged over a mine on the public road. The bureaucratic language of the claim sits alongside the reality of what it describes: a father trying to get compensation for the murder of his son by the army of his own country. In 10 days, across 3 locations, 17 men had been killed by the same method, under the same command, with the same cover story: 8 at Ballyseedy, 4 at Countess Bridge, 5 at Ballyseedy. The prisoners had been selected systematically from each of the 3 Kerry IRA brigades as exemplary executions designed to terrorize the entire county into submission. The 9 coffins prepared before the Ballyseedy explosion. The escalation at Cahersivan, shooting prisoners in the legs before detonation, demonstrated not chaotic rage, but organizational learning. The perpetrators adjusted their method after each event to ensure maximum lethality. This was not a war crime committed in the heat of battle. It was an administrative process. And then came the cover-up. In April 1923, a Free State Army Court of Inquiry was convened at Tralee to investigate the deaths at Ballyseedy. The inquiry was presided over by Major General Paddy O'Daly, the man who had ordered the killings. Sitting alongside him were Major General Eamon Price from General Headquarters and Colonel J. McGuinness of Kerry Command. The inquiry's conclusion was inevitable. All Free State officers and men were cleared of any wrongdoing. The blame was placed entirely on the anti-treaty IRA for allegedly planting the mine that killed the prisoners. When Labour Party leader Thomas Johnson raised the matter in the Dial, demanding accountability for the deaths of prisoners in Kerry, the Minister for Defence and Army Chief of Staff, General Richard Mulcahy, stood by O'Daly. Mulcahy publicly declared that it was inconceivable that Free State forces under his command would ever be capable of committing such atrocities. A confidential letter dated December 29, 1923, from the Secretary of the Ministry of Defence to the Ministry of Home Affairs, now preserved in government archives, shows that the state was fully aware of what had actually happened. But the official position held: no prosecutions were pursued. No officers were disciplined for the killings themselves. O'Daly remained in command of Kerry until he was eventually forced out of the army. Not for Ballyseedy, not for Countess Bridge, not for Cahersivan, but for a separate incident involving an assault on 2 young women. The University College Cork Civil War Fatalities Project has documented the full scale of what happened in Kerry. 71 men and boys were killed on the anti-treaty side in the county during the war, along with 1 member of Cumann Naamban. Of those, 17 were the prisoners murdered in the 3 mine massacres of March 1923. A total of 85 Free State soldiers died in Kerry before the war ended in May 1923, meaning Kerry was the single most lethal county in Ireland for both sides. The hatred was local, personal, and inescapable. As historian Stathis Kalivas has argued, civil wars are the cruelest conflicts precisely because the violence is driven by local factors, by neighbours who know each other, by grudges that predate the national cause, by proximity that makes anonymity impossible. In Kilflin, the small village near Tralee, where 3 of the Ballyseedy victims lived, families were split. John O'Shea's relatives included both George O'Shea, one of the 8 men killed at Ballyseedy, and Ned Breslin, a Free State soldier in the party that carried out the massacre. The same bloodline on both sides of the mine. The Republican underground government declared a period of national mourning and banned public entertainments and sporting events. Dorothy McArdle, who had access to survivors and witnesses, published Tragedies of Kerry in 1924, documenting the atrocities barely a year after they occurred. But for decades, the official state narrative held. Ballyseedy was an accident. The inquiry had said so. The Minister for Defence had said so. And Ireland, exhausted by revolution and civil war, chose to look away. Stephen Fuller never sought revenge. He was sheltered by local families until the war ended. And when Fianna Fáil came to power in 1932, he received the maximum pension of £150, as recorded in the military service pensions collection. He was elected to the Dáil as a Fianna Fáil TD, though those who knew him believed his reluctance to engage in the bitter divisions of Civil War politics contributed to his short-lived parliamentary career. He suffered from insomnia for years after Ballyseedy. He carried gunpowder and gravel embedded in his body until his death. It was almost 60 years before he spoke publicly about what happened in the interview with Robert Key that would become the definitive testimony of the massacre. His son, Paddy Fuller, has described what happened at Ballyseedy as a war crime. In March 2023, on the centenary of the massacre, multiple commemorative events were held across Kerry. Separate gatherings were organised by different political parties and independent committees, a reflection of how, even 100 years later, the Civil War's divisions have not fully healed. Tanaiste Michael Martin attended a Fianna Fáil-led event on March 4th and in his address described the killings as premeditated murder. It was the most senior official acknowledgement of what had happened, 100 years after the fact. Journalist and broadcaster Pat Butler, who produced a documentary on Ballyseedy, noted that if the same atrocity had occurred in Ukraine today, the world would be appalled. Calls were made for Stephen Fuller's testimony to be read into the official record of the Dáil. As of the centenary, this had not happened. The memorial cross at Ballyseedy was erected in 1959. It still stands at Curramacdonagh, County Kerry, among the trees where body parts hung from branches on the morning of March 7, 1923. Annual wreath-laying ceremonies are held there by the National Graves Association and the Ballyseedy Memorial Committee. The names of the 8 dead are inscribed in stone. Patrick Buckley, John Daly, Patrick Hartnett, Michael O'Connell, John O'Connor, George O'Shea, Timothy Tuomi, James Walsh, young men, all of them. Men who had fought for Irish freedom and were killed by men who had fought for the same thing. 9 coffins were loaded onto a lorry before the explosion. Not after. Before. The state knew what it was going to do. The state did it. And then the state investigated itself and found that nothing had happened at all.